Story 1. The Woods Chant. The idea of escaping the city for a weekend had been appealing from the start. The constant noise, the endless traffic, and the suffocating pace of life had all begun to take their toll. So, when my best friend Jake suggested we go camping deep in the woods, far from civilization, I jumped at the opportunity. We'd been planning this trip for months, carefully selecting a spot far from any trails or campsites, a place where we could truly disconnect from the world. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, the conversation between us light and easy as we talked about everything from work to the latest movies. But as we left the city behind and the landscape became more rural, the excitement in the car shifted to a quieter anticipation. The sun was just beginning to rise as we arrived, casting a warm, golden light over the dense forest that stretched out before us. We parked the car and strapped on our backpacks, heavy with supplies, before setting off on the narrow trail. The path wound through towering trees whose branches intertwined above, creating a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. It was perfect. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds of the outside world faded away, replaced by the rustle of leaves underfoot and the occasional call of a distant bird. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees growing taller and denser, their bark rough and ancient. It was as if we were entering a different world, one untouched by time. After several hours of hiking, we found a clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was a small open space surrounded by thick trees, with a soft bed of moss underfoot. The clearing felt almost hidden, a secret spot untouched by other campers. We pitched our tent, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in for the night as the sun dipped below the horizon. As the sky darkened, the forest around us transformed. The chirping of birds gave way to the chorus of crickets, their steady rhythm blending with the crackle of our campfire. The flames flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the trees, and the warmth of the fire felt comforting against the cool night air. We ate our dinner, chatting about nothing in particular, enjoying the solitude and the simple pleasure of being away from everything. The night deepened, the sky above a blanket of stars, and we decided to turn in, eager for a good night's sleep after the long hike. I awoke sometime in the middle of the night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the forest was eerily quiet. For a moment, I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard a faint sound just outside the tent, like the soft crunch of something moving over the forest floor. I sat up, my heart beginning to race. Jake was still asleep beside me, breathing deeply. The sound came again, closer this time. I listened carefully, trying to identify what it could be. An animal, perhaps a deer or a fox, but something about it felt off, made my skin prickle with unease. I slowly unzipped the tent flap and peeked outside. The forest was dark, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I scanned the clearing, looking for the source of the sound, but saw nothing unusual. The fire's embers glowed faintly, casting a dim light, but there was no movement, no sign of anything out of place. Relieved, I started to pull the flap shut when something caught my eye just beyond the edge of the clearing, where the shadows of the trees were thickest. There were footprints. They were clear, unmistakable imprints in the soft earth, leading towards our tent. My breath caught in my throat. They were too large to be from an animal, and too fresh to have been there before we set up camp. I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who could have made those prints? We hadn't seen anyone else all day, and we were miles from the nearest town. The thought of someone or something lurking in the darkness, watching us, sent a chill down my spine. I shook Jake awake, my voice barely above a whisper. He grumbled, rubbing his eyes, but when he saw the look on my face, he sat up instantly, alert. I pointed to the footprints, and his expression shifted from confusion to alarm. We sat in silence, listening for any sound, any sign that we weren't alone. That's when we heard it, the chanting. It was distant at first, so faint that we might have missed it if we weren't straining to hear. A low, rhythmic murmur, like a voice carried on the wind. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unsettling, a monotonous drone that seemed to seep into the very air around us. The chanting grew louder, more distinct, though the words were still incomprehensible. It was coming from the direction of the footprints, from the dense woods just beyond our camp. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. We exchanged a glance, both of us too scared to speak. The chanting was getting closer, more intense, and with it came a sense of dread that hung heavy in the air. Then, through the darkness, we saw him. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light of our dying fire. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes ragged and filthy, hanging off him like tattered rags. His hair was long and matted, obscuring most of his face, but what I could see in his eyes was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. They were hollow and empty, as if there was nothing human behind them. He stood there, swaying slightly, his lips moving in that same eerie chant. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the words, whatever they were, seemed to vibrate in the air, filling the clearing with an unnatural energy. Jake and I were frozen in place, unable to move, unable to tear our eyes away from the figure. For what felt like an eternity, he just stood there, muttering to himself, his eyes unfocused. Then, without warning, he lunged at us, his arms outstretched, his chant turning into a guttural scream. We scrambled backward, tripping over each other in our panic. Jake grabbed a branch from the fire, brandishing it like a weapon, the embers flaring to life as he swung it at the man. The figure recoiled, a low growl escaping his throat. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, his hollow eyes flickering with some unreadable emotion. Then, with a final haunting whisper, he turned and fled back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as suddenly as he had appeared. We didn't wait to see if he would return. We grabbed what we could carry and bolted, leaving our tent and most of our gear behind. We ran through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, the chanting still echoing faintly in our ears. When we finally reached the trailhead, exhausted and terrified, we collapsed on the ground, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. It wasn't until the sun began to rise that we felt safe enough to move again. We reported the incident to the authorities, but they didn't seem surprised. They told us about the man, how he had been living in the woods for years, performing strange rituals, targeting campers who wandered too far into his territory. We never went back to that forest. Even now, years later, the memory of that night sends a chill down my spine. The man, his hollow eyes, and the haunting chant still linger in my mind, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places, but the story doesn't end there. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The image of that man, his empty eyes and the sound of his voice, haunted my dreams. I found myself waking up in a cold sweat, the echoes of his chant still ringing in my ears. Jake tried to move on, to forget about that night, but I couldn't. Something about the whole experience gnawed at me, refusing to let go. I began to research the area where we had camped, hoping to find some explanation, some clue that would make sense of what we had encountered. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. The forest had a long history, one that was filled with stories of disappearances, strange sightings, and unexplainable events. There were tales of an ancient cult that had once inhabited the area, performing dark rituals in the woods, rituals that were said to summon forces beyond human comprehension. The cult had vanished long ago, but the legends persisted, passed down through generations of locals who knew better than to venture too deep into the forest. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that what we had encountered wasn't just a man, but something far more sinister. Something that had been awakened by the rituals of the past and had never truly left. One night, driven by a need for answers, I decided to return to the forest. I didn't tell Jake I knew he would try to stop me, but I couldn't ignore the pull that the place had on me. I had to know the truth. I arrived at the trailhead just before dusk, the sky darkening as I made my way into the woods. The path was overgrown, the trees thicker than I remembered, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As I walked, the familiar feeling of dread began to creep over me, the air growing colder with each step. It didn't take long to find the clearing where we had camped. The remnants of our fire were still there, the charred wood scattered across the ground. But the tent and the rest of our gear were gone, taken by either the authorities or scavengers. The clearing felt different now, more oppressive, as if the very air was weighed down by the memories of that night. I stood in the center of the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was silent, the only sound the whisper of the wind through the trees. But I could feel it, the presence that had been there that night. It was still here, watching, waiting. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I had come here for answers, but now that I was back, I wasn't sure I wanted them. The fear that had haunted me since that night was back in full force, a cold, gnawing terror that threatened to overwhelm me. And then, just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard the chanting. It started as a low murmur, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second. The same eerie, monotonous drone that had filled the clearing that night. My eyes snapped open, and I spun around, searching the darkness for the source of the sound. There, at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the dying light, stood the figure. He was exactly as I remembered him, tall, gaunt, his clothes tattered and filthy. His eyes were fixed on me, hollow and empty, and his lips moved in that same haunting chant. Fear gripped me, freezing me in place. I wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of my car, but my legs refused to move. I could only watch as the figure began to move towards me, his steps slow and deliberate, his voice growing louder with each step. As he approached, the air grew colder, the wind whipping through the clearing with an unnatural force. The trees seemed to sway and bend, as if reacting to the presence of the figure. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. When he was only a few feet away, the chanting stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, the absence of sound more terrifying than the chant itself. The figure stood before me, his hollow eyes boring into mine, and for a moment time seemed to stop. Then, without warning, he reached out, his hand grasping my wrist with a strength that belied his frail appearance. His touch was icy cold, sending a shock of pain through my arm, and I cried out, struggling to break free, but his grip only tightened, his eyes never leaving mine. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he spoke, "Come with me." His words sent a wave of terror through me, and I fought harder, trying to wrench my arm from his grasp. But it was no use. He began to pull me towards the edge of the clearing, his strength dragging me along despite my efforts to resist. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, the fear turning my blood to ice. My vision blurred, and the world around me began to spin, the trees and the clearing fading into a dark, swirling void, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The figure released me, and I fell to the ground, gasping for breath. The clearing was empty, the figure gone as if he had never been there. The chanting had ceased, and the forest was silent once more. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, my mind reeling from what had just happened. When I finally gathered the courage to stand, my legs were weak, my body trembling uncontrollably. I stumbled out of the clearing, not daring to look back, and made my way back to the trailhead. The sun had long since set, and the darkness of the forest seemed to press in on me from all sides. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The need to escape, to get as far away from that place as possible, drove me forward. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I drove away without looking back. The memory of the figure's cold touch and his haunting words burned into my mind. I never spoke of what happened in the woods that night. Not to Jake, not to anyone. The fear that had driven me to return to the forest was gone, replaced by a deeper, more primal terror that I couldn't shake. Even now, years later, I can still feel the cold grip of the figure's hand on my wrist, still hear the echoes of his chant in my dreams. The forest may have been miles away, but the darkness I encountered there followed me, a shadow that refuses to fade. I know that I will never truly be free of it. And every time I hear the wind whispering through the trees, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting, watching, ready to call me back to the woods. Story 2: The Neighbor's Visit. The rain battered the windows with a relentless fury, the wind howling as if in a mournful lament. I stood by the living room window, my breath fogging up the glass as I watched the raindrops race each other down the pane. The storm outside was ferocious, the sky dark and foreboding, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning that briefly turned the world to stark black and white. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, the only sounds the ticking of the clock and the distant rumble of thunder. My parents had left just after dinner, rushing out the door with promises to return soon. An emergency at work, they said. It wasn't unusual for them to be called away unexpectedly. They both had demanding jobs, but tonight felt different. The storm had transformed our usually warm and welcoming home into a shadowy, unsettling place. The familiar creaks of the house now seemed menacing, and the flickering lights only added to my growing unease. I tried to distract myself with the television, flipping through channels in search of something to hold my attention. But nothing worked. The sitcoms felt hollow, the canned laughter grating against my nerves. Even the nature documentaries I usually found soothing seemed ominous, with predators stalking their prey in dark, rain-soaked jungles that mirrored the storm outside. Finally, I turned off the TV, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, something lurking just beyond the edge of my awareness. That's when I heard the knock at the door. It was a sharp, sudden sound that cut through the noise of the storm, jolting me from my thoughts. My heart skipped a beat. Who would be out in this weather? The thought of opening the door to a stranger in the middle of such a tempest was terrifying, but curiosity tugged at me, urging me to investigate. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to stay put, but eventually I found myself moving towards the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I paused, my hand hovering over the handle, anxiety tightening in my chest. I took a deep breath, then slowly turned the knob, opening the door just a crack to see who or what was on the other side. A woman stood on the porch, drenched from head to toe. Her hair was plastered to her face, her clothes soaked through, clinging to her body like a second skin. The porch light flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across her features. But I recognized her. She was the new neighbor who had moved in a few houses down. We had exchanged polite greetings once or twice, but that was all. She smiled, but there was something off about it, a strained, unnatural curve of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. Those eyes. They were wide, almost wild, darting around as if searching for something, Or someone, "Are you alone?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. The question caught me off guard. It was such a strange thing to ask, especially from someone I barely knew. Why would she want to know? I hesitated, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. Finally, I nodded slowly, unsure of what else to do. Her smile faded, and she tilted her head slightly, as if studying me more closely. The silence stretched on, filled only by the pounding of the rain and the low rumble of thunder. I could feel my anxiety rising, my heart beating faster in my chest. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the storm as quickly as she had appeared. I stood there, frozen, watching her figure dissolve into the darkness. The rain swallowed her up, leaving me alone with the unsettling echo of her question, "Are you alone?" I quickly shut the door, locking it behind me with trembling hands. The encounter left me feeling uneasy, the sense of dread lingering long after she had gone. I returned to the living room, but the house felt different now. The once familiar and comforting space seemed oppressive, the shadows longer and darker. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a living creature, and the occasional flicker of the lights only heightened my sense of unease. I couldn't focus on the TV anymore, my thoughts constantly drifting back to the woman on the porch and the strange look in her eyes. Time passed slowly, the minutes stretching into hours. I tried to distract myself with books, with music, but nothing could shake the feeling that something was wrong. The storm showed no signs of letting up, the rain hammering against the windows with a ferocity that made the whole house shudder. I was about to head upstairs to bed, hoping that sleep would offer some escape from the growing anxiety, when I heard a creak, soft but unmistakable, coming from above me. It was a sound so faint that I might have missed it if I hadn't been so on edge. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, straining to listen. The house was old, prone to settling, but this was different. It wasn't the usual groan of the floorboards or the rattle of the windows. It was a sound that spoke of movement, deliberate and unsettling. Panic surged through me. I was supposed to be alone in the house. My parents weren't due back for hours, and no one else had a key. My first instinct was to run to bolt out the front door and not stop until I was far away from this house. But some irrational part of me needed to know, needed to see what was causing the noise. I slowly climbed the stairs, each step feeling like an eternity, the wooden boards creaking underfoot. The air grew colder as I ascended, the temperature dropping sharply, and with it, the tension in my body heightened. The house seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing closer, the shadows growing deeper. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated, listening intently. The silence was oppressive, thick with the weight of the storm and something more, something I couldn't quite identify. I turned towards my parents' bedroom, the door slightly ajar, and pushed it open, my breath caught in my throat. Two men stood in the room, their backs to me. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by the dim light filtering in through the rain-streaked windows. I didn't recognize them, but the sight of them sent a jolt of fear through me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who were they? What were they doing in my house? And why hadn't I heard them before? Before I could process what was happening, one of the men turned his head slightly, as if sensing my presence. Panic took over. I spun on my heel and bolted back down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I could hear them moving behind me, the sound of their movements filling the air with a sense of urgency that drove me to run faster. I reached the front door, fumbling with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The door flew open, and I stumbled outside, the cold rain hitting me like a wall of ice. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. My voice was barely coherent as I tried to explain what had happened, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. By the time the police arrived, the men were gone. The house was empty, just as I had left it, but the officers found signs of a break in upstairs drawers opened, belongings tossed around. There was no sign of the men, no clue as to who they were or what they wanted. I stood in the rain, watching the flashing lights of the police cars, unable to shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that they would come back, or worse, that they had never really left. The police took my statement and assured me that they would patrol the neighborhood, keep an eye out for anything suspicious. They were kind, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. It was a stormy night, and I was just a kid home alone. Maybe I had imagined it all, they seemed to think. Maybe the storm had played tricks on me, made shadows dance and sounds echo in ways that weren't real. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. And the memory of those men, of their silent figures standing in the darkness, was burned into my mind. That night, I couldn't bring myself to stay in the house. The thought of being there alone, with the storm still raging and the memory of those figures fresh in my mind, was too much to bear. I called a friend of my parents, a kind woman who lived a few blocks away and had always been like an aunt to me. She came and picked me up, her eyes full of concern as she bundled me into her car and drove me to her house. I spent the night on her couch, wrapped in a blanket and trying to stay awake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those men again, standing in the darkness, their faces hidden, but their presence unmistakable. The storm continued outside, the wind howling and the rain lashing against the windows, but it was nothing compared to the storm of fear that raged inside me. The next day, my parents came to pick me up. They were horrified by what had happened, by the idea that someone had broken into our home while I was there alone. My mother couldn't stop hugging me, tears in her eyes, while my father kept talking to the police, trying to get more details, trying to understand how this could have happened. But there were no answers. The police had found nothing, no fingerprints, no clues, nothing to explain who the men were or what they had wanted. It was as if they had never been there at all. The only evidence was the mess they had left behind, the overturned drawers, the scattered belongings, the open windows that had let the rain in. My parents wanted to stay with me that night, to keep me close and make sure I felt safe. But I couldn't go back to that house, not yet. The thought of walking through those halls, of sleeping in my own bed, made my stomach churn with fear. So we stayed at a hotel, a bright, sterile place with clean sheets and heavy curtains that blocked out the night. But even there, in the safety of that room, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump, every creak of the floorboards or rustle of the curtains setting my nerves on edge. I kept imagining the men, standing just outside the door, waiting for me to let my guard down. Days passed, and slowly the fear began to fade. The storm ended, the sun came out, and life started to return to normal. My parents had the locks changed, added security cameras, and installed a new alarm system. They did everything they could to make me feel safe, to reassure me that nothing like this would ever happen again. But the memory of that night stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the men were still out there, watching, waiting. Every time I walked down the street, every time I was alone in the house, I felt their presence, just on the edge of my awareness, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. And then, one night, it happened again. It was late, and I was in bed, trying to fall asleep. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning. My parents were asleep in their room down the hall, and for the first time in days, I was starting to feel like maybe everything was going to be okay. But then the silence was shattered. It was subtle at first, a barely perceptible creak of the floor above me, but enough to make my breath catch. It was the same sensation as before, the unnerving awareness that something was moving, just out of sight. My heart leapt into my throat. I lay there, frozen, the tension building in my chest like a vice. I wanted to scream, to run to my parents' room, but I couldn't move. The sense of being watched grew stronger, the air thickening with the weight of something unseen. I finally forced myself to move, to sit up in bed, my body trembling with fear. I knew I had to see what was happening, to find out if I was imagining things or if the nightmare was real. Slowly, I got out of bed, my feet touching the cold floor, and crept towards the door. I opened it a crack, just enough to peek out into the hallway. The house was dark, the shadows long and deep, but I could see the stairs leading up to the second floor. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, but the silence was complete. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out into the hallway and made my way towards the stairs. Each step was agonizingly slow, my muscles tense with fear. The air grew colder as I ascended, the temperature dropping sharply, and with it, the tension in my body heightened. The house seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing closer, the shadows growing deeper. When I reached the top of the stairs, I paused, listening intently. The silence was oppressive, thick with the weight of the storm and something more, something I couldn't quite identify. I turned towards my parents' bedroom, the door slightly ajar, and pushed it open. What I saw froze the blood in my veins. There they were again, the two men, standing in the same spot where I had seen them before. Their backs were to me, but this time there was no doubt they were the same men. Their clothes were dark, wet from the storm that had raged outside, and they were still, unnaturally still. I wanted to scream, to shout for my parents, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed, my body refusing to obey my frantic mind. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Then, slowly, one of the men turned his head, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. It was pale, ghostly pale, and his eyes were dark, empty, like two black holes that threatened to swallow me whole. That was all it took. I bolted, running down the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't stop until I reached my parents' room, throwing open the door and shouting for them to wake up. They were groggy, confused, but the panic in my voice must have been enough to convince them that something was wrong. My father grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat he kept by the bed, and we all made our way back upstairs, but when we reached the bedroom, the men were gone. There was no sign of them, no trace that they had ever been there at all. The room was as it should be, quiet, undisturbed, with nothing out of place. My parents searched the whole house, checking every room, every closet, but there was nothing. No intruders, no signs of a break-in, nothing to explain what I had seen. They tried to reassure me, to tell me that it was just a bad dream, a lingering fear from the night of the break-in. But I knew better. I knew that what I had seen was real as the fear that still clung to me even in the safety of my parents' embrace. That night, none of us slept. The next day, my father called the police again, but they found no evidence of anyone being in the house. The security cameras showed nothing, and the alarm had not been triggered. It was as if the men had never existed at all, as if they were nothing more than figments of my imagination, but I knew the truth. They were real, and they were still out there, watching, waiting. But I knew the truth. They were real, and they were still out there, watching, waiting, and as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, that fear never left me. Every time I was alone in the house, every time the wind howled outside or the floor creaked under my feet, I could of my all feel them, just on the awareness, lurking in the shadows, and I knew deep down that one day they would come back. Story 3: The Cemetery Stalker. The cemetery had always been a place of peace for me, a sanctuary where the noise of the world fell away and I could be alone with my thoughts. Every Sunday for the past 5 years, I visited the grave of my late wife, Eliza. It had become a ritual, a way to keep her close even though she was no longer here. The cemetery, with its old oaks and silent tombstones, was where I could talk to her, where I could remember the life we shared. That particular Sunday, the sky was a dull gray, the kind of gray that promised rain, but never quite delivered. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the world in a cold, muted light. The wind had a bite to it, unseasonably cold for late spring, cutting through my jacket as I made my way up the familiar path. The gravel crunched under my feet, the only sound in the stillness of the afternoon. I parked my car at the entrance, as I always did, and walked the short distance to Eliza's grave. The cemetery was large, but I knew every turn, every stone, as if they were old friends. It was a comfort, in a way, to have such familiarity in a place most people avoided. But that day, as I walked towards Eliza's grave, something felt off. There was a man standing a few rows away from her grave, close enough for me to notice, but too far to make out his features. He was still too still, staring in my direction with an intensity that made me uneasy. I had never seen him before, and though it wasn't unusual to see others visiting graves, something about this man felt wrong. He wasn't looking at any particular grave, just staring, as if waiting for something. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the task at hand. I knelt beside Eliza's grave, brushing away the leaves that had gathered there. The headstone was simple, just her name, the dates of her birth and death, and a short inscription, beloved wife and mother. I ran my fingers over the letters, feeling the cold, smooth stone beneath my touch. "Hey, Eliza," I said quietly, as I always did. "It's me. I know it's been a rough week, but I'm getting through it. The kids are doing well too. Sarah just got promoted, and Michael's team made it to the finals. They miss you, you know. We all do." Talking to her this way made me feel closer to her, even though I knew she was gone. It was a comfort, a way to keep her memory alive, and it helped me cope with the emptiness her absence had left behind. But that day, as I spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The man was still there, in the corner of my vision, unmoving. It was as if he was studying me, analyzing my every move. I tried to focus on Eliza, on the memories we shared, but his presence was intrusive, unsettling. After a few more minutes, I decided it was time to leave. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my pants, and took a step back from the grave. As I did, I realized the man was closer now, much closer. He had moved without making a sound, and now stood only a few yards away, his eyes fixed on me. My heart began to race. He was tall, his clothes worn and dirty, and his eyes. There was something wild in them, something that sent a shiver down my spine. "Got any money?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. The way he said it, with no trace of politeness or hesitation, made my skin crawl. "I don't have any cash on me," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. It was the truth. I rarely carried cash anymore, especially when visiting the cemetery. I never had a reason to. He didn't seem to believe me. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Don't lie to me," he hissed, his voice filled with anger. "Everyone's got something. Give it to me." I shook my head, more out of instinct than anything else. "I don't have anything for you," I said, trying to sound firm, though my pulse was quickening. He was blocking my path back to the car now, his stance aggressive. I could see the tension in his body, the way his fists clenched and unclenched. This wasn't just a man looking for money. This was something more dangerous. The air around us seemed to thicken, the cemetery no longer a place of peace, but one of hostility. The tombstones, once silent witnesses to the past, now seemed like they were watching, waiting for something to happen. I glanced around, hoping to see someone else, anyone who could help, but the cemetery was empty. It was just me and this man, who was now standing only a few feet away, his breath ragged and uneven. "Give me what you've got," he demanded again, his voice rising in anger. There was a madness in his eyes now, a dangerous glint that made my blood run cold. He wasn't going to let me leave without getting what he wanted. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. But I knew I couldn't overpower him. He was younger, stronger, and desperate. I was trapped with no way to defend myself. The fear was overwhelming, a primal terror that I hadn't felt in years. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My legs moved before my mind could catch up, the instinct to survive overwhelming everything else. I heard him shout something behind me, but I didn't stop to listen. I sprinted down the gravel path, the sound of my footsteps echoing in my ears, mixing with the wind that had picked up, howling through the trees. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. When I finally managed to unlock it, I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it in one frantic motion. My breath came in ragged gasps as I looked up, expecting to see the man right behind me, but he wasn't there. I scanned the cemetery, my eyes darting from one shadowy corner to the next, but he had vanished. It was as if he had never been there at all. The only thing that remained was the memory of his wild eyes and the way he had demanded something I couldn't give. I drove straight to the police station, my heart still racing, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I told them everything about the man in the cemetery, how he had confronted me, how he had blocked my path, and how I had barely escaped. They took my statement and said they would investigate, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. People visit cemeteries all the time, they said. Maybe they thought it was just some homeless man looking for a handout, but I knew it was more than that. A few days later, I got a call from the police. They had found the man who had confronted me, but he wasn't alive. They found his body in the cemetery, beneath a broken grave, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. There was no sign of how he had died, or how he had ended up under that grave. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The police asked me if I knew anything more, if I had seen anyone else in the cemetery that day. But I hadn't. It was just him and me, just us and the graves. The news of his death shook me to my core. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at me, the desperation in his voice, the madness in his eyes. What had happened to him? Had he been dead when he confronted me? Or had something else, something darker, claimed him after I left? I still visit Eliza's grave, but now I only go during the day, when the sun is high and the world feels safe. But every time I walk down that familiar path, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me, lurking in the shadows between the tombstones. And sometimes, late at night, I dream of those wild eyes and hear that rough voice demanding something I can't give. Weeks passed, but the fear lingered. I became jumpy, easily startled by the smallest sound. The thought of returning to the cemetery filled me with dread, but I couldn't stay away. I needed to see Eliza, to tell her what had happened, to seek comfort in the one place that had always brought me peace. But the cemetery was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a place of nightmares, haunted by the memory of that man. The next time I visited, I went during the early afternoon, hoping the daylight would chase away the shadows that had taken root in my mind. But as I walked the path to Eliza's grave, the familiar crunch of gravel underfoot, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes kept darting to the side, expecting to see that man standing there, his wild eyes fixed on me, but the cemetery was empty. I reached Eliza's grave and knelt down, trying to find solace in the ritual that had once brought me comfort. But my words felt hollow, as if I were speaking to the wind, and the cold, unfeeling stone beneath my fingers did nothing to ease my anxiety. "Hey, Eliza," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry I haven't been here as often. I've been. I've been scared. Something happened, and I don't know how to explain it. But I feel like I'm being watched. Like he's still here." I paused, my eyes scanning the surrounding graves, half expecting to see him lurking nearby. But there was nothing. Just the silent tombstones, the swaying trees, and the ever-present chill in the air. "I miss you," I continued, my voice breaking. "I don't know what to do without you. You always knew how to make things better, how to calm me down when I was scared. But now I'm lost." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I let them fall, not caring if anyone saw. I was alone, after all. Alone with the dead, but as the tears fell, I felt a presence behind me. A cold, unnatural stillness that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, expecting to see him there, standing just a few feet away, but there was nothing. The cemetery was empty, the path behind me clear. But the feeling didn't go away. It clung to me, like a shadow that refused to be shaken off. I quickly stood up, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the cemetery itself was trying to keep me there. I glanced around one last time, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, but I saw nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, remained. I practically ran back to my car, my heart pounding in my ears, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I needed to get out of there, to escape the suffocating grip of the cemetery. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that man standing in the middle of the path, watching me leave, but he wasn't there. There was no one there, just the graves and the shadows. When I got home, I locked the doors and closed all the curtains, trying to shut out the world. But the fear followed me, creeping into my mind, invading my thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about the cemetery, about the man who had confronted me, about the feeling that I was never truly alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside sent a jolt of fear through me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened, of what might still be out there in the early hours of the morning, when the darkness was at its deepest. I heard it, a sound faint but unmistakable, coming from the hallway. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer to my bedroom. My heart stopped. I held my breath, my body frozen in place. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were just outside my door. Then, silence. The air was thick with tension, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. I could feel someone or something standing just outside my door, waiting. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time seemed to stretch, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I forced myself to sit up, my body trembling with fear. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grasp the switch, but when I turned it on, the light revealed nothing. The room was empty, the door still closed. There was no one there. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart, but the fear didn't leave me. I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. The presence was real. And it was still out there. The next day, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed answers, needed to know what had happened to that man, why he had confronted me, and why I felt like I was being watched, even in my own home. I returned to the cemetery, this time in broad daylight. The sun was shining, the sky clear, but the sense of unease remained. As I walked the familiar path, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight. I reached Eliza's grave and stood there, silent, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The cemetery was quiet, peaceful, as it always had been. But I knew better. The peace was a lie, a facade hiding the darkness that lurked beneath. As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. The grave where the man's body had been found was covered in fresh dirt, as if it had been recently disturbed. My heart skipped a beat. I approached it cautiously, my mind racing with possibilities. When I reached the grave, I saw that it had been dug up, the earth still loose and unsettled. But there was no sign of the man's body, no indication of what had happened. I stared at the grave, my mind spinning. What was going on? Who had dug up the grave, and why? As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I felt that familiar presence behind me. A cold, suffocating sensation that sent a chill down my spine. I turned slowly, expecting to see the man standing there, his wild eyes fixed on me, but there was no one there. Just the empty cemetery, the silent tombstones, and the wind whispering through the trees. I left the cemetery that day with more questions than answers, my mind haunted by the events of the past few weeks. I didn't know what to believe anymore, didn't know if what I had experienced was real or just a figment of my imagination, but one thing was certain. The cemetery was no longer a place of peace. It had become a place of fear, a place where the dead didn't rest easy. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, watching, waiting for me to return. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.